Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is Cureton, Senior Journalist from XR Today, bringing you the latest and greatest from the VR, AR, and XR industries. So today we have a very special guest as well. We have on Yago. He is what we call Cheerleader-in-Chief for the decentralized finance platform Sovryn. So Eden, it's a wonderful pleasure to have you on today. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll go ahead and begin. We'll start a little bit about the platform Sovryn. So can you explain to us what is Sovryn and why was it created?
Sovryn is an extension of Bitcoin, and it's a community-based project where we're building the ability to build a world on Bitcoin. And that means that Bitcoin started out by providing us with decentralized money, which is globally accessible to anyone without any censorship. In other words, no one can stop people from transacting. And what we're doing with Sovryn is we're building the tools that allow us to build an entire financial system, which is as decentralized and is built as sound finance on that sound money. The ability to have communication systems, the ability to build decentralized institutions. And the way that we basically are doing this is we're building layers on top of Bitcoin, which allow us to have effectively anything built on Bitcoin. And so that's what Sovryn is. That's what Sovryn's mission is. And where Sovryn is today is it's built out an entire suite of financial products which are decentralized, based on and backed by Bitcoin. And that includes things like trading, lending, Bitcoin-backed stablecoins, and so that's become the largest platform of its kind in the world. And now we're looking to extend the functionality of Bitcoin even further.
Excellent, excellent. And there's going to be a lot of implications for this in the near future, as far as allowing people the freedom to use and spend on metaverse platforms in the future, Web3, peer-to-peer exchanges as well, and also global remittances as well. Because I noticed that there is a strong rise in people using decentralized finance for world remittances. So I was going to ask you also this. Speaking of remittances, like what are Sovryn's target markets and like how does it empower users in those specific regions?
So Sovryn as a platform doesn't exactly have target markets. Products have target markets, and so the products that plug into Sovryn have target markets. So that depends on who's plugging in. It can be systems or users who are using it because they have a lot of Bitcoin and they want to trade or they want to borrow against their Bitcoin without having to go through a centralized intermediary. It could be people in places like El Salvador who want to have access to dollars which don't require US banking, and can be based on the Bitcoin that exists in El Salvador, because El Salvador, as probably a lot of people know, have adopted Bitcoin as legal tender. It can be people in Zimbabwe using it for remittance purposes. And all of these things are currently happening with Sovryn. I would say that most people who are using Sovryn today are fairly sophisticated, since it's a relatively new technology. And so it tends to be people from Europe or the US. They tend to be wealthier and better educated. A lot of them come from finance or computer backgrounds, but more and more we're seeing a broad swath of people using Sovryn.
Absolutely, yeah. And so, I think also that you had mentioned a while back that people in Indonesia as well is becoming very popular in that specific reason. I guess Southeast Asia, because we notice a lot of these people can just buy the Bitcoin or buy the Sovereign tokens, move them over, and then you've got the ability to send it to whoever you need to in those specific regions. So it's a lot of freedom of choice to do that. So yeah, for you, I was going to ask you about. We can see like some current and potential use cases for Sovryn. Now, speaking about it, going from remittances, then we go into Web3 tools, metaverse platforms, because there are a lot of Sovryn tokens that are taking place across these different types of platforms. How would you theoretically or currently use Sovryn in Web3 and metaverse platforms?
Well, I don't think we've seen people really integrate metaverse with Sovryn yet. Probably because metaverse isn't really a thing that exists yet. Our lives are becoming increasingly digital. And so people are managing, especially younger people, tend to manage more and more of their lives in digital worlds, and that includes more and more of their economic lives. Now, this idea of metaverse, I think, is a bit of a catch-all phrase for the idea that eventually we will live perhaps all of our lives or significant parts of our lives in this sort of digital world, which goes beyond just TikTok and computer screens, but is actually immersive. And I think that's true. And I think it's almost unquestionable that we're heading there. And so the question is, what does the economy of an increasingly digital world look like? And I would say that there's several aspects to it. First of all, digital world is dematerialized. It doesn't recognize national borders. Our economies today are all regulated, or all based on the assumption that they're regulated by the governments of nation states and within their own borders. That doesn't work in a digital world. The other aspect of it is that we currently assume that most of our property, our assets, the things that we buy and sell, that we trade for and that we work towards, are physical objects. That is also becoming increasingly less true. More of our spending is in services or digital assets. And so we're going to see a bigger and bigger part of the economy existing in this borderless and, as a result, ruleless world, and having a large number of different types of assets. This is going to require a digitally native currency. And that kind of digitally native currency is Bitcoin, or what we've introduced. If you think of Bitcoin as gold, they used to issue pounds that were redeemable for gold, or dollars that were redeemable for gold. So we've created stable coins, which are redeemable and backed by Bitcoin. And so they are like Bitcoin, but without the volatility. And we're going to need to create institutions, sort of like everything that we're familiar with: courts of law, property rights, ways for communities to govern and organize themselves. All of this is going to need to be replicated in the digital realm. And the way that we do that is we're building those tools which allow Bitcoin to effectively also become the highest court, right? So if you register a property, especially digital assets, and we're starting to see this with NFTs on Bitcoin, then your rights are unimpeachable. If you create a smart contract, and what is a smart contract? It's like a legal contract, but it's written as computer code, and it executes itself directly. That is governed by Bitcoin. And so these are sometimes difficult concepts to get our heads around, but what we're seeing is the creation of a world which is more and more digital, and as a result, what Sovryn is doing is building the institutions that are going to be the fundamental institutions for that kind of world. So there's no interaction between Bitcoin and the metaverse as such yet, or Sovryn and the metaverse as such yet. Rather, it's an evolutionary process, and sort of the metaverse is a metaphor for where we're going.
Gotcha. Very interesting observations about that, and I appreciate that. So we notice also that in the market, what we see is a lot of different changes happening with Bitcoin and stable coins and things of that nature, especially with Security and Exchange Commission, the FTC, a lot of these different U.S. institutions. What can you tell us about what's happening right now with the SEC cracking down on a lot of the cryptocurrency markets?
Well, I think it's more correct to say that the SEC is attempting to crack down on the crypto markets. And I'll go back to what I said a moment ago, right? These are institutions which are designed for a physical, industrialized world. We live in a dematerialized digital world. So the SEC is trying to impose its jurisdiction on crypto, which is extraterritorial to the United States. In fact, extraterritorial to any nation state currently existing. And as a result, that's proving to be very, very difficult. The laws don't account for crypto. The SEC has been, questioned repeatedly in congressional hearings about whether or not they're able to provide any regulatory clarity to the space. And now, because of that, they've eventually been forced to take companies to court, and it's entirely unclear whether or not the courts will even find the SEC is able to enforce these regulations. And so what we're likely to end up is one of two scenarios. One is an extremely draconian regulatory environment where the SEC and potentially other global regulators, despite the fact that they weren't really developed to regulate dematerialized worlds, will attempt to anyway. The other option is that the dematerialized world, in sort of the same way that the internet was kind of carved out in the late 90s from a regulatory perspective in the US and then later in other countries, will be recognized as effectively its own jurisdiction. In either of these cases, what I think is going to happen is that we're going to see the institutions that succeed being digitally native institutions. That means DAOs instead of companies. It means blockchains instead of jurisdictions or nation states. And so I think one way, for perhaps the most correct way to think about what is happening now, is that blockchains and the decentralized organizations or institutions that are being developed on them are effectively the equivalents of the countries of the physical world, right? So each blockchain is effectively a sovereign entity with its own rules. That's what blockchains do. They create rules in the digital world. So money is a rule, right? Money doesn't actually exist. It's like it's a rule that if I transfer X amount of paper to you or tokens to you, that has certain value. Property is a rule. It's a rule that I own something and you don't. Contracts are a rule that if we've agreed to something, we need to execute on our agreement. All of these are basically rules. And what blockchains excel at is enforcing those rules in the digital space. So it's not a coincidence that we've called the project Sovryn. We are building sovereign institutions for a sovereign environment, an environment which is extraterritorial to the nation states and the courts and legal systems that they've created.
Right. Yeah, and those raise a lot of interesting questions, especially related to futurism and like how these technologies are completely revolutionizing the way people interact, the way things are defined in the in the immersive space, or as well as in the physical space. And so it'll be interesting to see how they rule on this, because I know that cryptocurrencies are expected to boom based on the SEC ruling and the way the companies respond to it, because they've gone after Coinbase, Binance. These are some of the biggest companies in the world when it comes to centralized cryptocurrency platforms. But we're going to also see a major pushback from decentralized DAOs that are faced with this kind of challenge as well. So yeah, anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap it up for today?
I think you mentioned Coinbase as being the largest company in the space. That's true if you're thinking about companies sort of in the old way of thinking about them. But you can think of things like Sovryn or Ethereum as effectively the descendants of companies, right? In the same way that human beings are the descendants of apes, right? The next phase from an evolutionary perspective. And when you think about it in that way, those new kinds of organizational tools of human organization, right? Human institutions are vastly larger, more active, and more valuable than Coinbase. So I think perhaps the best thing is to end on the William Gibson quote, right? He said, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And so we're continuing to build that future, and we're trying to make sure it's evenly distributed to everyone.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for those insights, and we do appreciate your time and attention for that. Once again, we've been speaking to Yago. He is the cheerleader-in-chief for Sovryn, or one of them, I suppose. It's a decentralized platform that allows people to, buy, sell, and trade using cryptocurrencies. And it's an amazing platform. We'll include information about that in the description box below. Once again, my name is Cureton, senior journalist from XR Today. And if you'd like to follow more conversations like this, please join us at the XR News hashtag on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thanks so much for your time for today. It's a pleasure, and until next go round. Bye now.
Thank you.